Hi, Dan Kaufman. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Dan Tippens. It is always good to see you.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and introduce ourselves a little bit. I am Dan Tippens. I am one of the editors at the Electric Agora and best friend of Dan Kaufman over here. And Dan, why don't you introduce yourself briefly for us?
So I am also an editor of the Electric Agora. Dan and I, of course, as you all know, as many in our audience will know, founded the site together. And I'm also a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. And yes, Dan and I are very good friends. So good, in fact, that when I was in New York a few weeks ago, I dragged him along with me on what can only be described as a food orgy tour through Chinatown and Little Italy, which was tremendously enjoyable.
Yeah,
I found a soulmate. I found someone who can eat and as much and as enthusiastically as I
yeah,
can.
I'm still recovering from that. I didn't let you know during the trip, but I was dying, stuffing my face there.
Were you really?
Yeah,
No, you aren't.
that was the best part. That was the best thing in my life.
So, what are we doing today, Dan Tippins?
So Dan Kaufman, today we are. By the way, should we just note to the audience we're going to continue to use each other's last names for the entirety of the dialogue?
Probably. That's a
Okay,
good
great.
idea.
So today we're going to be talking about moral intuitions and their role in motivating behavior and their relationship to moral theories. Now, I've left this intentionally vague because this is going to take on many different forms of questions that would answer all of these different things that I just laid out. And this is kind of a follow-up dialogue on a piece that you wrote in the past on moral intuitionism or moral intuitions, um, where you were criticizing anyone who had claimed that we could evaluate our moral theories on anything besides moral intuitions. Um,
I at least,
so
I at least said,
consistent.
I at least said, I at least said that moral intuitions ultimately provide the conditions of adequacy against which any moral theory is measured. So I did say that intuitions ultimately provide the grounds for moral theories, and that moral theories therefore are can't be moral theorizing can't be prior to ultimately to our moral intuition. So I did say that, and I guess part of the reason we wanted to do this was to explore the subject in more depth. Um, Partly in reaction to there was quite a bit of discussion on after the article posted, and so it seemed like people were interested in the topic. So it seemed appropriate to do perhaps a more in depth discussion of it.
And I can't lie. I mean, it's also just fun talking about moral intuition.
That's true. So why don't you start us off since you are more organized than I am?
Great. So, I mean, I'm just starting off primarily with a question that we can go back and forth on a little bit. And the question is, what are moral intuitions? So let's get started with you here.
Right.
Tell me.
So what I mean by a moral intuition is basically my moral intuitionism is largely a product of the work of H.A. Pritchard and W.D. Ross, who are probably the two most famous moral intuitionists, and they're both philosophers of the early 20th century, and early to mid 20th century, and W.D. Ross is probably most famous as a translator of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. You know, chances are, if you've read the Nicomachean Ethics in translation, you read W.D. Ross's translation. It's the one that you get on Oxford University Press. And I mean, there have been subsequent, in some ways, more accurate translations, but his is really the one that's most commonly read and is still sort of considered one of the best. But he also is pretty well known for a book called The Right and the Good, which I think is one of the best works of moral philosophy of the last century. And he there takes an intuitionistic approach to ethics. Pritchard does it in his moral philosophy as well. And the piece there that's really influential is a piece called "Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake?" Which and I'll provide links to both of these maybe underneath the video when it posts. So my sense of a moral intuition, my notion of a moral intuition is roughly the ones that they talk about, and that is, by a moral intuition, I simply mean our basic feelings of obligation and duty, right? And so for example, suppose you and I have a conversation and we agree to have lunch next week, and I promise to meet you at noon at the restaurant. In making that promise, I feel obligated to meet you at the restaurant at noon. That's all I mean by a moral intuition. Our basic, pre-theoretical, ordinary, everyday, common feelings of duty and obligation that arise from all sorts of situations and relationships that we find ourselves in. That's all that I mean by moral intuition. I don't mean anything that requires any kind of special faculty, right? And that's often the charge that's leveled against intuitionists is, that means you have to commit to some mysterious faculty of intuition by which you intuit these moral obligations. And my answer to that is this is nonsense. Everybody knows exactly what we mean when we talk about a basic feeling of obligation and duty, because we all experience this on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. So let me push you a little bit here to get to see what you have to say. So I can understand so we can call what your position the feeling-based account. It's some kind of feeling to do one thing over another, or just to do some action.
Or not to do some action.
Or not to do some action,
right.
Yeah. So we can call that the feeling-based account. And then there's an alternative view, which is prevalent in other domains of philosophy where you have intuitions that are playing a role, which would be the cognitivist view, or the belief-based account, which is intuitions occupy a special class of belief. Did you hear me? Did you hear me okay?
I heard you. There was just some noise on your end, but it's not a
Yeah,
problem.
sorry. Something fell down. So anyway, the other view, besides the feeling-based view, would be a belief-based account, or in the philosophical literature, a cognitivist account. Mm-hmm. So it would, intuitions would occupy a special class of beliefs whereby they are foundational beliefs upon which further beliefs are derived or justified. And typically, another way to put this is maybe that they're non-inferential. You don't infer these beliefs from anything else.
Right.
And these are also beliefs that we have kind of very strong confidence in, very, very persistent and strong confidence in.
Yeah.
So these, whereas not all of our beliefs are like this, right? We can have some beliefs that we're a little bit, iffy on, don't have, too high a degree of credence, so to speak, in these beliefs. And you could also build into this cognitivist account the idea that there is some special phenomenological feel to these beliefs. These things just seem self-evident, or they seem true, whereas not all beliefs are like that. Now, to kind of motivate the cognitivist account a little, maybe I could say something like this. So here's where I think there's definitely a place where your feelings of obligation happen, and there's just a feel and not an accompanying belief. So a good example would be you walk by, let's say like the first time you ever walk by a homeless person before you've lived in New York and you see homeless people a lot and become awkwardly accustomed to it. The first time you see a homeless person, you will have this feeling that you want to help them. And and that kind of drives you to maybe donate some money to them or buy them a meal. But you don't necessarily, at least, from my point of view, it's not like I token some belief. It's not like I think to myself, I believe that I ought to help this person, and that motivates me to action. So there's definitely room for the feeling-based account somewhere in our ordinary lives, at least in terms of what motivates our action, is this feeling of obligation. Now, but you might think that there's room for the cognitive-based account or the belief-based account for moral theorizing. So consider when you're in a philosophy classroom and you give a thought experiment and you elicit moral judgments. The ordinary language talk is frequently to say something like, I believe that you ought to, let the 5 die, or let the 1 die over the 5 in the trolley problem. It's not like people are saying, I have a feeling right now to help these 5 people. In fact, that might seem odd that would happen in a classroom. this is where it looks like the belief-based account might have a little bit more traction, is when it comes to theorizing in the philosophy classroom, which is typically where you end up, where at least philosophers end up building their theories. In these thought experiments of idealized conditions where you're eliciting moral judgments, which seem to be kind of reflective of beliefs. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so well, first off, and I'll talk about the context that you just mentioned next, but let me just respond to the first part first. Look, I just think that the belief account of these basic moral intuitions is untrue to the experience of them. In other words, to use a word, the phenomenology of such experiences is such that these are felt. And in other words, I don't believe that when in the scenario that I described, that when I reflect on our conversation, I don't believe that reflection gives rise to the belief that some proposition is true, namely that I ought to meet you for lunch, that I ought to keep my promise to meet you for lunch. I simply feel obligated to meet you for lunch. Now, some people may want to say, well, you're just, that's just sort of an argument by stipulation, or, what evidence do you have? I mean, all that I can say is, consider your own experience and tell me if I'm wrong. But let me say one more thing in favor of the way that I'm looking at it.
Yeah.
I would maintain that intuition, that moral intuition, is inherently motivational, right? That is, that part of its phenomenology is an impetus to action. And I agree with Hume that merely to assent to a proposition provides no impetus or motivation for action. That is, there's nothing inherently motivational about propositional attitudes, beliefs that P. Which is why Hume says all ethics is ultimately based on the passions and not on reason, because no amount of believing that P is ever going to make anyone moved to do P. And so I would argue that inherent to the phenomenology of the experience of duty is a certain kind of impetus that only feelings of obligations have, but beliefs that such and such is right or such and such is obligatory do not have. Now, with respect to the scenario you painted, I mean, I think in a sense you kind of answered it for me by describing the situation as one in which we're theorizing. We're engaged in theorizing. And I actually don't think that what passes for intuitions that come up in those sorts of highly artificially designed cases are really moral intuitions at all. Let's put it this way. I don't believe that any encounter in which you and I are sitting in a classroom having a discussion about some hypothetical case of a trolley is going to tell us anything about what our actual feelings of obligation would be if you were standing on the track right in front of the guy deciding whether to shove him or not. In other words, the fact that you're not in the fact, both Ross and Pritchard are of the view that these feelings of obligation arise from the actual scenarios that we are in and the relationships that we are in to others. They don't arise out of theoretical discussions of hypothetical scenarios, right? And so I actually think that whole way of going about doing ethics is just a mistake. I think that, that is part of what more generally I would call engaging in theoretical inquiry into morals, not actually engaging moral situations where the actual sense of obligation and duty arises.
So I guess it's just I've always
I guess let me just say one more thing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess what I'm saying is that I could easily see you deciding after engaging in a discussion in a classroom that you believe that P regarding the trolley case. And I could very easily see if the next day you were actually in the trolley situation, standing there, that you could do the opposite. In other words, I have zero confidence in the sort of conclusions that people come to in reflecting on those cases abstractly. I don't think that anybody knows what their feelings of obligation and duty are until they're in the situations.
Okay.
At best, you can sort of hypothesize, but it
Good.
strikes me as highly fallible.
Yeah, so this is actually a question that we're going to come to later. This is the last part of the talk. We're going to discuss what role moral theories play in motivating our behavior. Do they play any at all, or just what are they doing? What are moral theories doing? Yeah. So let's kind of bracket this for now and move on to another question which I had, which perfectly comes up now, which is, okay, so you've given the feeling-based account of moral intuitions, and we'll stick with that for this dialogue, unless minor quibbles need to be made here and there. But then, so here's a good question: Are all moral intuitions equally good? And now this requires some cashing out, obviously. What do we mean by equally good here?
Yeah.
And so, let me just kind of hand this over to you and see what you think.
Well, wait a minute. You're going to have to tell me what you mean by "are they equally good"? Because how can I answer it unless I know what you mean by "are they equally good"?
Yeah, so this is going to be tough.
Do you mean are they sometimes incorrect?
Here's what I want to say. Here's a good way to put it. Let's say that you and I are in a moral situation. There's a baby drowning in the river, and you and I see the baby drowning. I have no feeling of obligation, or I have a feeling of obligation. Let's say to. I have no feeling of obligation or a feeling of not obligation. Let's say that. A feeling that I ought not save the baby. And you have the feeling that you ought to save the baby. Just the feeling, we're not talking about a belief, right? You just have that motivational feeling. Are both of us equally kind of justified here when we go and save or don't save the baby?
Okay, so that's those are several different things, right? So, firstly, one obviously can't speak of justifying an intuition. So the question is whether the intuition justifies the action. And, the way I think about obligation and duty is very much, and this is just simply straight out from Ross, right? I believe that every felt obligation and duty constitutes a prima facie duty. That is, every genuinely felt obligation constitutes a prima facie duty. That prima facie duty, however, can be overridden depending on features of the circumstances, right? So when I agreed to meet you for lunch, I felt a prima facie duty to keep that appointment, right? Mm-hmm. But suppose on the way to meeting you for lunch, I pass an accident and see someone out bleeding in the street, and there's no sign of an ambulance or paramedics or anything else. I also feel obligated to help that person. And in those circumstances, given all sorts of considerations, my feeling of obligation to save the person overrides my feeling of obligation to meet you for lunch. Okay? So I do believe that one prima facie duty, one felt obligation can override another felt obligation. However, I also agree with Ross that an overridden obligation doesn't cease to be an obligation. In other words, it continues to leave what's often called traces in our behavior. And so, if I stand you up for lunch and therefore violate my prima facie obligation to keep my promises, right, I'm going to feel obligated to make it up to you. I may offer to pay for the lunch next time in return for the inconvenience and for my breaking our date. In other words, it's not as if the overriding of the duty doesn't render the overridden duty no longer a duty. It's simply that the overriding duty takes precedence given those circumstances. Now, if I change the circumstances slightly, that wouldn't be the case, right? So if in passing the accident, I see that paramedics are already on the scene and they're already taking care of this person, then my feeling of obligation to help the person would not override my feeling of obligation to help to meet you, to keep my appointment with you. And so in those circumstances, there would be no overriding of the feeling of obligation. So um, prima facie, moral intuitions are fallible in the sense that they're overridable, right? And I do think that if, in the case in which I decided, in the first case where there's no paramedics and no EMT on the scene, if I then decided to meet you for lunch nonetheless and let the guy bleed to death, I think I would have made a mistake, right? But I don't believe that there is any sort of procedure or theoretically informed considerations that could render those kinds of choices not fallible, right? In other words, the fact that I can make a mistake in considering circumstances and deciding whether one prima facie duty overrides another isn't anything against the intuition as to kind of duty. It's simply the way things are, right? With respect to human life and human experiences, we do sometimes make mistakes in examining situations and deciding which duties override the other, and we may realize later that we've made a mistake, right? But that's not, for the most part, I would think, because of any theoretical consideration, and I don't see how any theoretical consideration would help us to prevent making such a mistake. Now, in terms of look, if at the end, if what you're asking, with the second part of what you said with regard to the two people, one who doesn't feel obligated and one who does, look, at some level, you're probably some invocation of human nature is not going to be avoidable, right? We're talking about feelings of obligation and duty. We're talking about passions and about emotions, and those are, part of our physical nature, right? I'm going to wonder about the health or well-being of a person who sees a baby drowning and feels no obligation to save the person, because I also agree with Ross again that most of these that our moral intuitions arise out of the many varieties of relationship that we have to others. Right? So he lists a whole bunch of types of relationships that we have to other people, all of which give rise to various prima facie duties, various feelings of obligation and duty. And so I'm going to wonder whether the person who doesn't feel any obligation to save a drowning baby isn't mentally ill in some way, right? Assume would have to say
Right.
that that's a deformed sentiment, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I have a few questions here
Yeah.
for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So
That's the
first,
whole
let's
point.
just so Dan Kaufman.
Something you
answer
can't
me-
do, something you can't do in a blog post, right? I mean, you can actually have
Exactly.
a conversation. So
Yeah,
go
see, this
for
is
it.
good.
Go for
So
it.
okay, so first, let me just ask you, what does overriding mean? When you say one moral obligation overrides another, I guess I take it what you meant by this was just you feel stronger about doing one more than
Well,
another?
that each obligation, each of the two obligations, each of the two obligations which are felt in that situation entail actions that cannot both be performed.
Yes.
I can't both keep my date with you and also save the bleeding person on the street.
Yeah.
And so when I say that one duty overrides the other, what I mean is that in considering the circumstances, I take the one duty to be more pressing than the other.
What does it mean to say you take it to be? That's what I was getting at. So is that just you feel stronger? You feel more strongly? Because this is a feeling-based account. So does this just mean that one of them has a stronger feel to
right.
it?
So in considering the situation, I'm standing there, I'm sitting there in my car, and I'm looking at the guy bleeding on the street. And then I'm also thinking of my obligation to meet you. And I just feel much more strongly upon acting on the first feeling than acting on the other. Pritchard actually says, when we doubt whether or not we really were obligated to do something, it's not any theory that's going to tell us that. It's putting us back in the situation and seeing if the feeling of obligation arises again, right? He has interesting things to say, by the way, about knowledge. Also, he makes the interesting observation that that's also true. If I wonder whether I've been mistaken in adding two numbers, I don't consult the theory. I add the numbers again. I do the sum again, right? And see if I get the same answer. And so I don't see how theoretical. I guess part of what I don't. The reason
we're bracketing the whole like theoretical thing for now. I'm just
no.
trying to
Okay,
get
right,
count
right,
out here. Yeah,
right.
because the
So
theoretical
yes.
stuff we're going to get into later.
So yes, when in the situation, when considering what I'm seeing right in front of me, and the sense of obligation to which it gives rise, and then as I'm sitting there, reflect upon, but if I help him, I'm not going to meet Dan. I feel a greater impetus to help the guy than to go meet you. That's the sense in which the prima facie duty is overridden. But it doesn't cease to be a duty. That's the sense in which it continues to leave traces in my behavior. I still feel obligated to meet you for lunch, just less obligated than helping this guy, and I can't do both.
Yeah.
But in other words, I don't want you to think that I say this because that's what needs to be the case in order for my theory to be true. That's what I actually think describes what happens when we are in these situations.
Yeah, and I can, look, and so, just to be clear, so I actually, no matter what, I agree that there are feelings of obligation.
Yeah.
To me, denying that would be as insane as would I take eliminativism about the mind to be.
Right, there are no mental states, right?
Yeah, to me, I would take eliminativism about the feeling of obligation to be just as insane as that.
Right.
It's just denying a feature of our existence that we all undergo. So I don't want to deny that. But what I want to at least consider is whether or not this feeling-based account can adequately describe or explain all of our moral experiences. So I'm also thinking. So I keep on thinking that in my day-to-day life, I do think about moral beliefs, especially when I experience conflicting feelings and obligation. So I was thinking about when I experience conflicting feelings and obligation, I frequently do enter a cognitive state where I think like, ought I do X over Y?
Look, I don't deny that, but what I don't think about is utilitarianism or Kant. Sure. What I think about are the morally relevant features of the situation, right? I think about what happens if I don't help that guy bleeding on the street. I think about what happens if I stand Dan Tippens up, right? But all those considerations.
Well, then you feel really shitty about yourself.
Right. All that thinking about the context is thinking about those features that give rise to the feeling of obligation. In other words, when I feel conflicted, what I'm experiencing is uncertainty as to which prima facie duty is overriding. But I don't see how that can be answered by appeal to any beliefs that I have, right? That gets answered by the thinking that one does in those situations is a thinking that involves re-immersing ourselves in various features of the context, right, of the scenario. And seeing what feelings that reconsideration gives rise to. That's exactly what Pritchard means when he says, if I ever doubt whether I'm obligated to do P, I don't consult the theory. I re-immerse myself in the situation in which the initial obligation was felt and see if I feel it again, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the. I agree with you that we engage in that sort of thinking when we're conflicted, but my view is that what that thinking consists of is thinking about the features of the context that give rise to the feelings of obligation and duty in the first place.
Okay, so here's what I'm wondering.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if I can try and make some wiggle room once again for a belief-based account of intuitions here. So here would be the picture. The picture would be like this. This would be the alternative picture to you. It would be something like, what gives rise to those feelings are actually beliefs. And those beliefs are the intuitions. So we think about our beliefs frequently when we have these when we have conflicting feelings, because the beliefs are the things that are giving rise to those feelings to begin with. So here's.
I did an example. That's very abstract.
Yeah.
My initial reason for saying that I don't think that beliefs lie at the bottom of this is because beliefs have no intrinsic impetus. They have no intrinsic motivational phenomenology, whereas I think that feelings of obligation do, and I think that that's actually what characterizes our experience.
So I'm wondering. So let me actually just push you a little bit, maybe, on the question of whether or not beliefs can be motivational in any way at all.
Mm-hmm.
So they may not be motivational in the same way, in terms of the same phenomenological feel of motivating you to do something. But perhaps we can still make room for them being motivational in a different way. So consider weakness of will, for example. Let's say that I believe it's in my best interest to not eat the chocolate bar, or not eat chocolate for a month, or something like that. Okay. However, I go to I go to some grocery store to buy my apples, and I see a chocolate bar right in front of me right at the cashier's line. And the weakness of will account, or if I were weak-willed, I would recognize, oh shit, I've got this belief, I really shouldn't eat chocolate, but I still feel this strong desire to eat the chocolate. And so there are cases where if you're weak-willed, presumably, you eat the chocolate, right? But if you're not weak-willed, your belief still determines your action insofar as you resist. You resist coming to that feeling.
I don't think that's how these things work at all. I mean, that description just sounds to me so untrue.
Really?
To the actual experience of these. So let me give you my version of what you just said, okay?
Good.
Presumably there's a reason why you believe that you ought not to eat chocolate. So let's say that you weighed as much as I do, okay? Which, I can only wish upon you. I can only look forward to the day when your metabolism crashes and burns, because no one should be thinner or better looking than I am.
Which, of course, I am not.
No, you are, unfortunately. That's why I'm jealous.
Go on, Dan Kaufman. Tell me more.
So the reason, obviously, is something to do with your health. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that I ought not to eat this chocolate because I care about my health. I feel motivated to want to. Notice something about that, by the way. I could believe that something is bad for my health and still happily continue on doing it anyway, because that belief doesn't translate into a desire into a desire to preserve my health, right? Yeah. I have to care about my health in order for that belief to do any work at all, right? To do any work in the realm of action, right? So I come to the supermarket, and there's the chocolate bar, and I feel a desire for the chocolate. I feel a craving for the chocolate bar. When I sit there and wrestle with myself, which is what the weakness of will scenario paints, right? This wrestling with oneself and then either failing or succeeding, right?
Yeah.
When I fail, right? Rewind. When I'm wrestling with myself, I'm again considering the situation. So I'm thinking about my felt desire to be healthy, and I'm thinking about and what gave rise to all of that. Probably things to do with my daughter and my wanting to live long enough to not abandon her midlife by croaking too early, and so on and so forth. All these other feelings, by the way, are wrapped up. Feelings of obligation are wrapped up in that. And then I also consider my desire for chocolate, deliciousness. I consider how much I care about living, how long, and all that sort of thing. And then, yes, if I go one way, it's simply because the desire for the deliciousness and beauty is greater than the desire to stay alive longer, right? In other words, the situation you described strikes me as being almost identical to the one I discussed with regard to whether to meet you for lunch or meet the person or save the person on the street. The thinking I'm doing is reconsidering the context that gives rise to these competing feelings, right? These feelings that lead to incompatible actions, and then it's a matter of whether one is felt more strongly and thus overrides the other, right?
Sure. Yeah.
The way you described it strikes me as artificial. I don't think that that's what happens.
Okay. Let me give one last. I mean, I'll give one last 2-second little like motivator here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there once again.
I would be, by the way, interested to know once you're done with this part. I'm interested to know what you think rests on this. In other words, why you think we might want to take the belief account rather than the feeling account. So,
okay. I'll tell you a little. A couple of things.
But go on first with your last round of this argument.
Yeah. So what I was going to say was, I can still agree with you that there are. So there, I'm kind of adopting, by the way, your methodology here of kind of reflecting on my own experience, my mental life when I undergo these things like weakness of will cases.
Well, what else would one do? I mean,
Yeah.
Can't look inside other people's heads.
I'd look to some theory, Dan.
Right, of course.
So, there are definitely times of weakness of will where I do undergo the mental clashes that you've just described, where I think about what I care, or I recognize what I care about, and and I desire to uphold what I care about, or maybe the caring just
and see what you feel more strongly. Yeah.
Yeah. But then there are other times where it's very quick and I just do something like this. I feel the desire for the chocolate and I literally just say to myself, I told myself I wouldn't eat chocolate. I don't reflect any further. I don't, at least, nothing consciously pops up like I strongly desire not to eat the chocolate or I really desire not to eat it. I just literally tell myself like I decided that I wouldn't eat the chocolate.
Right, but how is that a belief overriding a feeling? That's not an example of a belief overriding a feeling.
So my thought was, when I tell myself, when I say I told myself I wouldn't eat the chocolate, this is me saying I believe I ought not eat the chocolate, right? Like I told myself X is saying like this is what I believe, right? I agreed to this with myself before.
I don't know.
You don't think so?
No, I don't. I just. To me, beliefs are simply. A belief is simply to assent to a proposition, to the truth of a proposition. And what you just described to me sounds to me like, you reminding yourself. What you're reminding yourself.
I'm telling myself I believe that it's best for me not to eat the chocolate.
Right, but
it's a prudential belief.
Right, but the reason it's best for you not to eat the chocolate is because it's going to negatively affect your health. But unless you care about negatively affecting your health or not, that belief is not going to make you not eat chocolate.
Here's what I should say. I can agree with you that cares are the things that are going to motivate or that are going to allow me to have these kinds of beliefs. What I'm simply saying is, in actual cases where you're experiencing a weakness of will temptation, I've at least found that at times I just mentally think of the belief that I have, and that inspires me to just like resist the desire to eat the chocolate. I don't think about what I care about or have these feelings of what I care about. I've got this strong desire for the chocolate, and then I say, but I believe that it's best for me not to eat it, and I walk.
Look, I can't tell you what you say to yourself. I just don't see how the belief that I ought not eat chocolate can override the feeling of a desire to eat chocolate, unless it's basically a shorthand for saying I feel more strongly about keeping the promises I made to myself.
Yeah.
In other words, you promised yourself not to eat chocolate, and in reconsidering now the situation, you're simply reaffirming that promise you made. You feel more duty bound to keep that promise that you made to yourself than you do to eat the chocolate in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't you?
With that in mind, let me say.
Why don't you tell me what you think rests upon, What hangs on whether we go do it one way or the other?
So you could have, so first of all, I think that if you, depending on which view you take of intuitions, the feeling based or the belief based, could have a significant impact on your answer to a question we're about to discuss, which is that of moral expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Is there such a thing as moral expertise? So, a lot of times when it comes to domains of expertise, they're belief based and not feeling based. In fact, feeling based are the very things where people say there's no such thing as expertise, just snobbery. Think about wine connoisseurs, for example. Unless they have, if all they're doing is like reporting their experiences and not any beliefs about the flavors, about what's actually the case. It seems that there can't be such a thing as moral expertise
Okay.
in feeling-based domains.
All right. So was that all, or is there more to it? Because I have something to say about what you just said. But if there's more to it, I want to let you finish the thought before I respond to what you just said.
There is more, but I'd prefer you go first.
Okay. So I wouldn't agree that there's no expertise in taste.
Great.
So, well, look. Here's the superficial, stupid answer. If there's no such thing as expertise in taste, how come no one's going to make you a wine critic for the New York Times? But they are going to make the other guy a wine critic for the New York Times.
Or are you actually asking?
Yeah, I am.
So you could give.
If there's no expertise in art, why would the Metropolitan Museum of Art not hire you as a curator?
Not hire me as a curator. So,
right, but would hire Philip de Montebello or whoever. I don't know who it is now. But.
So I think we need to draw a distinction here. So you can be an expert in the sense of knowing facts about the subject matter, but not an expert in terms of your feelings being better than other people.
You think that somebody? You think that somebody hires somebody as a? You think somebody hires someone as a wine critic because they know facts about wine, or because they're better tasters of wine?
Let me ask you an equally rhetorical question.
I mean, that's not my answer.
I'm done. I'm just saying. Let me ask you an equally rhetorical question, though. You think that you can be more of an expert at your feeling of flavor? Your feeling of flavor is more expertise-ness, or is more full of expertise.
I think that somebody can be a better taster of wine than somebody else. Yes.
Okay, so that, by the way, is a harder question to ask. I was going to say, though, to answer your rhetorical question, which was, why would the Metropolitan Museum of Art hire some person who has an art history and, massive art background over me as a curator or as a critic? Someone could give. I'm just saying someone could give. I'm not saying this is my answer. I actually do think there's expertise as well in things like tasting wine, where one person's feel is actually more expert than another person's feeling. But someone could give an answer to your rhetorical question, which would be something like, look, the guy who knows art history, he knows where this art situates in history, and he knows the various techniques that were used. But it's not as though his evaluation, this piece of art is beautiful, would be more expert than someone who says it isn't.
That's not true.
Right. So I'm saying someone could give that kind of answer.
But a curator, that's not the basis on which a curator is hired. You know how many people have that kind of art historical knowledge? The curator is hired partly on the basis that he's going to pick the better paintings for their collection. And that's a matter of taste, right? Which are the better paintings. It's a matter of taste. Mm-hmm. Look, Hume has an essay called "Of the Standard of Taste," which I actually did a Electric Agora this week special piece on, and Hume certainly offers at least some what he would call criteria for being how shall I say, an authoritative critic. Now, I don't think that, for the reasons that I discussed in the essay, I don't think that any such criteria could provide a kind of standard of taste, or what you mean is some kind of justification for the claim X is better than Y. But I do think that the kinds of traits, characteristics that Hume describes in that essay do get at some of the characteristics that we typically assign to the people who we think are the better tasters. So one of the things that makes you a better taster of, let's say, food or drink is the ability to make fine-grained discriminations in flavors and tastes. I can, if you gave me, an Islay malt, a Highland malt, a Lowland malt, a Speyside malt, I could tell you the difference, right? A completely uneducated, Scotch drinker could not, right? That's part of what makes me a better taster of Scotch than that other person, and that's why those are the kinds of reasons why someone, let's say, who owned a chain of liquor stores, would hire me to decide what scotches to carry, not somebody who couldn't tell the difference between, a 15-year-old Highland malt and some shitty bottom shelf blend, right? And so I do think that there's such a thing as expertise with respect to taste. If what you mean by expertise is something like we can distinguish between better and worse tasters, right? I don't think if what you mean by expert is someone whose judgments are always justified in a rational sense, that is, whose judgments are sort of guaranteed to be true, that I don't think. But better tasters, yes, absolutely, they're better tasters, and that's true for wine and beer and spirits, as well as it is for food, as well as it is for paintings, as well as it is for a lot of other things. So I don't know that if that's where you're going, you're going to say, well, there's going to be a problem for morals because we can't distinguish some relevant sense of an expert. I would say you can, to the extent that there's even a credible notion of expertise. You can on the feeling view, and I don't think you can get anything more out of it on the belief view anyway.
Here's how.
Anyway, I'm happy to go with you down that road.
You could. I mean, so obviously there are uncontroversial domains of expertise such as physics, mathematics, or like chemistry, and obviously these are typed frequently by convergence upon certain beliefs,
right,
and ability to give justifications for those beliefs, right?
But notice what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that they're never wrong.
No.
Right.
No, of course not.
Right.
But the idea is there's convergence and there is ability to give justification. And you might also think, this is also what some other people have said, one other mark of expertise is, and by the way, a lot of these are contestable, and I just really want to pick your brain on this because I've only recently started to delve into this expertise stuff, and it's really interesting, actually. So anyway, one other thing that might mark an expert is that they have intuitions. Now, intuitions here might mean something different from what you mean. At least in the case of physics, that probably means a belief. Not some feeling of, So, they have intuitions where lay folk have none. So a physicist has intuitions about quantum theory X or, this physical problem Y that's unsolved. Whereas a layperson will have absolutely no intuitions on it.
Right.
So so these are some things that might type expertise.
But I don't know that those hold on a second. I don't know that those intuitions play the same role relative to the theorizing that the scientist does. That the intuitions I'm talking about play relative to the theorizing we do in ethics. Just to be clear about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go on.
Agreed. Also. Good note. So anyway, so the reason the belief view might matter is so you have convergence. And there's justification for the convergence. And there's intuitions where there are none for the layfolk. Now, when it comes to art, for example, or wine, this isn't the case, right? So when it comes to art, many layfolk will have intuitions about whether or not this is a beautiful painting or not. There will not be convergence, even amongst art critics, about whether or not a painting is beautiful or not.
To some extent, I mean, there's tremendous overlapping consensus. I don't know any critics who are going to say Rembrandt's a bad painter, right?
Well, it
Um,
might
um,
depend.
um,
I guess it might depend
I
on
mean,
which school you're in.
certainly.
So,
Look, even sort of the very ideological critics, like so take someone like Clement Greenberg, who was a hardcore formalist, and he was very much part of the vanguard of critics advocating for abstract expressionism, and he says various things about what is ultimately valuable in art and all of that. But even he is not going to deny that tons of much older representational art has all sorts of value and significance. And so, I mean, there is going to be substantial convergence. Whether it's more or the same or less than you have amongst experts in science, that's a different story. I don't know about that. That's something I can't answer just off the cuff. I will observe that there's tremendous disagreement about scientists. I mean, I know that amongst physicists, there's some people who think that string theory is not much better than Star Trek. And then there's other people who think that this is the future of physics. And so that it's the solution to the problems that they have and whatever. And so I don't know that we might not be overstating the amount of convergence that characterizes the people we call experts. Look, I don't think the notion of an expert is all that rigorous, and so I don't know that I would be able to define it. I would simply want to talk about better and worse tasters,
yeah. So,
more
like I
and less,
said, by the
more
way,
and
I
less
actually
competent
agree.
judges of physics.
Yeah. So,
Propositions
like I
in
said,
physics.
I actually agree with you
Yeah.
that there is expertise in things like
Yeah.
tasting and like art.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, you asked me what else hinges on the question of belief versus
Right.
feeling based, and you can certainly see someone making a case that some kind of field that has to do primarily with beliefs is one that is capable of having expertise,
Right.
and so it could it could affect the outcome of this view you have of moral expertise.
Right, because
that was just why I.
Right, so
yeah.
the idea is that, just for the audience to be clear, the idea is supposed to be, if the idea of expertise in play is meant to mean the possession of some set of propositional attitudes,
Which you can justify.
then we have a relatively clear notion of what expertise means. Whereas if by expertise we mean something like a better or worse taster or a better or worse feeler, as we mean in ethics, then the relevant notion of expertise is less clear or less easy to make. All that I would want to say is that, and I think that that's perfectly fair to say, all that I would want to say is, I think that we easily overestimate just how clear the notion of expertise is, even with respect to things like propositional attitudes. And I think we underestimate the degree to which there can be expertise in things like tasting and feeling. And that's probably because I just don't think that the notion of expertise, period, is a rigorous notion.
Yeah.
I think it's applied in a lot of different... If I did an ordinary language analysis of it, I think you'd find it's applied in a lot of different ways. It means a lot of different things.
Yep.
Half the times it's used, it's meant rhetorically as some sort of honorific. I mean, you know what I mean? In other words,
absolutely.
I don't know that there is going to be any theory of expertise that's going to give us necessary and sufficient conditions for what counts as an expert.
Agreed.
Anywhere.
But even if you held your ordinary language view, you could still hold that there are some things that we just don't say are expertise.
Yes.
And you might think that the moral domain, if you have the feeling-based account, falls into that.
You might say that, but we'll have to see. I mean, I think I can I think I can talk about that in a way that I think
right, because it reminded me, your intuition-based account, or when you said something like, "Are there more expert feelers than others?" It just initially reminded me of like former roommates I've had or people I've met who say things like, "I'm really good at feeling people's energies. I'm really good at feeling."
Yeah, I don't mean anything like that.
Right. No. I'm just saying, like, and obviously there I'm like, there's no such thing as an expert feeler of energies.
Right. No,
Sorry.
No, because there's no such thing as energies in the sense that they mean.
What's funny is that's also more like they're actually just expressing. Really, I think that they're just expressing when they say, "I feel his energy," what they believe about them, what they believe about the person in question. At least many times they're like, I could feel that he was very angry. That's just her saying, her or him saying, I believe he or she was angry.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
By the way, you should probably remind everyone of what it is you're doing, because it looks like you're in an airplane cockpit.
Yeah, so I'm actually traveling to Missouri to visit you right now. I'm flying my private 747 here.
What is that up there? It's an alarm?
I'm actually in lab right now. We are currently conversing while I'm at work, which is, by the way, I have permission. It's
Okay.
okay. I'm not, yeah. But I'm actually just in a hood. So this is the fume hood right here, which is supposed to prevent um, a lot of shit from going wrong while you're working on certain biological
So
specimens.
does that mean
So
that if you pull down the hood?
when this glass thing is down to a certain level, you'll never hear, or there's this. That's like everything's okay, meaning that the hood is doing proper enough airflow that you shouldn't get screwed over by, or your biological samples shouldn't be screwed over. But if you raise it too high, an alarm goes off because it means the glass is high enough that the airflow isn't really preventing
So,
pathogens from getting in.
so if you lowered the hood all the way, could you like smoke in there?
Yeah,
Damn, I wish I had a hood because I'd love to like have a cigarette while I'm having this conversation. All right, go on. So,
okay.
where do you want to go next with it? I understand the frame you're working in.
Right. So what's our time at, by the way?
We're about 55 minutes, so we could go on another.
Shit.
Yeah, it's all right. We could go on another. We can go an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and 20 minutes.
No, right. I'm just gonna.
I wouldn't go more than that.
Here, let's definitely move on from moral expertise.
Yes,
because
we haven't even discussed moral expertise yet.
I know, we haven't, but we should really move on just because.
Depends on what else you got. Sure.
Okay, so let me see what you think here. So here was the next question I was going to ask you. What role do moral intuitions play in moral theory creation?
Okay, so
do you want to do that, or do you want to stay on the expertise?
I don't care. We can even still come back. We may go back to expertise. But I'm happy to do that. Because when most people hear people talking about ethics, they immediately think moral theories. They think Kant, they think Mill, they think these sorts of things. And so I think it's worth talking about those. I don't see any way to answer your question without, in a sense, saying what a moral theory is, right? What a moral theory does.
Yeah.
And let's just remind everyone what a moral theory is supposed to do, right? A moral theory is supposed to identify the general characteristics of rightness and wrongness, right? It's supposed to tell us what all right acts have in common and what all wrong acts have in common, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's very straightforwardly descriptive, okay? And notice something. It presumes that you already have a conception of right and wrong acts, right?
Yeah.
It simply wants to figure out what do those all have in common, right? What makes all the right acts right and what makes all the wrong acts wrong? Well, that presumes you already have a sense of what the right acts are and the wrong acts are. And the theory is simply telling you what makes them so, okay? So in answering your question, the first thing I would say is, unless we felt obligated in various ways, moral theorizing would never even arise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moral theorizing is an attempt to provide some kind of rational reconstruction of the feelings of obligation and duty that we already have, right? And simply to tell us what it is about things that causes us to have these feelings, and not those, right? That's all that it does.
Mm-hmm.
So my answer to you is simply that moral intuitions, first of all, the feelings of obligation and duty that we have ordinarily on a daily basis are the reason why we engage in moral theorizing at all. We then look to moral theories to try to provide some sort of a rational reconstruction of those moral feelings we already have. Now, given that that's the case, you really can describe moral intuitions, as I'm understanding them, as providing, in a sense, the subject matter for which it is the job of moral duties to explain. In that sense, I think moral intuitions are a lot like observations relative to scientific theories, and not at all like intuition as you normally encounter it in epistemology, which normally means something like belonging to our pre-justificatory common sense, right? I don't think that moral intuitions play the same role that intuition or common sense plays in epistemology, right? I think moral intuitions more play the role that observations play in epistemology, right? The job of a scientific theory is to make some sense, to give some rational reconstruction of the things we observe. And similarly, the job of a moral theory is to give some rational reconstruction to make sense of the obligations we feel. That said, notice observations can be mistaken, and moral intuitions can be mistaken, at least in the sense that I can mistakenly think that one is overriding when further consideration of the circumstance will reveal that to be untrue, to be incorrect.
I was going to also ask. Sorry, go ahead.
Let me just finish this line, and then you can. Now, that being said, given that moral intuitions provide, in a sense, the subject matter that it's the job of moral theories to explain, just as observations provide the subject matter whose job it is for scientific theories to explain, the ultimate condition of adequacy that any moral theory has to meet is whether, in fact, it does make sense of those intuitions, just as the ultimate consideration of adequacy for any scientific theory is whether it actually does save the phenomena. And that's why no moral theory ultimately can violate our moral intuitions, because the moral intuitions provide the conditions of adequacy against which moral theories are measured. Last thing on this. Why should you think that's true? Well, if you notice, most of what are taken to be the most damning objections to the various moral theories, whether it's Kant or Mill or whichever the others, the most damning criticisms are always the criticisms that point out when the theory yields perverse results. And all that we mean when we say that the theory yields perverse results is that it yields a judgment on an action that simply violates our moral intuitions regarding the action. So the typical most powerful objections to utilitarianism are when the greatest happiness seems to entail that we should do all sorts of stuff that intuitively we think is bloody awful, okay? Like gladiator games or organ harvesting or whatever it is you want. Similarly, the most damning criticisms of Kant's ethics have to do with all those cases in which Kant's ethics seems to tell us to do things, that we're required to do things that will cause harm, such as telling the truth, even when doing so will make nothing good happen and will cause someone to die, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually think that in other words, I don't even think I need to provide much of an argument for this. I think we know this already. All we need to do is look at the major objections to our moral theories, and they're all appeals to intuition. They're all appeals to moral intuition. I'm not denying that there are no purely internal theoretical problems with some of these moral theories. But what we take to be the really damning ones, the deal-breaking ones, are where they violate the moral intuitions, and especially when they violate them in a big way.
Yeah. Right. Okay. There is so much to say. Not necessarily like, oh, I have so much stuff to object to you about. Just there's just a lot to talk about here. So maybe this will help to clarify your view even more. I know it was already pretty clear, but I just at least wanted to bring this up. So here's a way you might think that our day-to-day moral decision-making is theory-laden, in the sense that, in a specific sense. Let me outline what I mean by theory-laden here.
Go on.
Okay. So what I mean by theory-laden here is evidentiarily theory-laden. So what we take to be as evidence for a feeling not being mistaken, or evidence for which feeling should override another, can be theory-laden.
Give me an example.
Yeah. So first, let me tell you let me also just for everyone, so we're all on the same page. Let me spell out what I mean what I mean by how a theory can influence what you take to be as evidence. So the classic example of this would be in physics. So let's say, I think this is given in almost every, philosophy classroom in philosophy of science, but something like this. So there's some vapor streak in a cloud chamber as evidence of the passage of like an alpha particle or something like that due to radioactive decay. By the way, as you can see, there's a ton of theory-laden language here, right?
Yeah, of
Language that
course.
only makes sense in within some theory. And so the idea is, when we say a vapor streak in a cloud chamber is evidence for the passage of an alpha particle, vapor streak in a cloud chamber is extremely theory laden. It only makes sense in light of a theory.
Right.
Now, you might think that this can happen after you've learned various moral theories. After you've learned various moral theories, you might think that your language becomes heavily theory laden. So when you have when you have a conflict between intuitions, say, should I help the homeless people or this homeless person, or should I get to my meeting? That when you look to features of the situation, or when you look at the context, you might think that this becomes somewhat theory laden. You think in terms of maximizing utility. You think in terms of duty, right? And maybe you think in terms of virtue. And these, it seems, at least after you've taken some philosophy classes and learned some theory, you might think that these become pretty theory laden. And in that sense, theories end up playing a role in our moral deliberations. What do you think about this?
See, I think that the theories are just much more sort of post hoc than you're giving them credit for. So, the idea, in other words, look, certainly, when I'm considering when I'm let's say I feel conflicted about whether to save the bleeding person on the street or whether to meet you for lunch. Okay, not that I would, I don't think, but let's suppose I was, and I was going through that kind of thinking that we both have been talking about, that what one engages in which I allege what I'm thinking about is I'm replaying through the situation, right? Either afterwards or while I'm there, right? Certainly, I'm going to consider things like the harm that's going to come to the guy if I leave him bleeding there, right? Versus the relative harm that's going to come to you if I stand you up for lunch. And I'm going to notice one is much less than the other. Certainly, I'm going to think about sort of the inherent force of promises, right? But this is where I think Ross's version of this of intuition is so strong. Ross says that these feelings of obligation arise out of various features of relationships that we have to other people. I just think that the theory just is what comes along later to try and make sense of all of that, in terms of to provide some sort of a story you can tell post hoc, right, about what it is you're doing, right, and why, right. I don't, and so while it may provide you with some new language, I don't know that it provides you with anything that, in a sense, you didn't already know. I mean, it provides you with terminology, but it doesn't provide you with any sort of really new categories of thought, because the moral theories themselves are simply a reflection of what the theorist took to be the most important relationships and thus the most important obligations and duties. In other words, the reason why someone's a utilitarian is simply because they decided that the feelings of obligation that arise from our relationships as benefactor to beneficiary override all others, right? And the Kantian thinks that a different set of of feelings of obligation that arise from a different set of relationships is overriding of all others. I think, while they're both wrong, is that nothing is ever overriding of all others. And so,
except for your promises to me.
And so I just don't see that they do that much work prior to acting.
Hmm. So I guess let me also ask you, just to zoom out for 1 second. I hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but I'm curious now. So you know how you continue to say that um, that desires or these kind of phenomenologically feelings are the things that motivate behavior that actually
Yeah,
cause us to act.
and that I'm simply echoing.
Right. Yeah. No.
In that
And
sense, I'm a human. I'm a
yeah.
human in
And so
that sense. I
let's
agree
say I
with him
agree with
about
you.
that. Yeah.
Most people would want to. No, almost no one would want to say that beliefs are like epiphenomenal and completely epiphenomenal, meaning that we just have beliefs, but they don't do anything at all to shape our actions in some
No,
way.
certainly not.
So let me ask you quickly, because this could, how do you think that beliefs do shape our actions? Because this can give you an answer as to whether or not you think that a moral theory could end up
I
shaping your
think that
actions.
beliefs often, or knowledge. Let's even talk about knowledge. Okay, that knowing certain things makes me aware of certain relations that I stand in relation to others that thereby may give rise to moral feelings of obligation. So suppose that I had no idea that there are massive famines going on in places like Somalia and Ethiopia and other places. Finding that out, having that piece of knowledge, will now cause the sort of me to become aware that there are a whole set of relationships to other people that I didn't know that I had, that now are going to give rise to feelings of obligation with respect to those people, right? Um, and so no one denies that knowledge provides information that in a causal sense may lead to feelings of obligation. But notice it's never going to do so directly. What it's going to do is it's going to make me aware of certain aspects of my or dimensions of my relationships to others, and those relationships are what give rise to feelings of obligation and duty.
Okay. So then let me,
Look, in
yeah,
that sense, this is
yeah,
just
that's
textbook.
great. This
This
is
is
great.
just textbook Hume. It's purely the knowledge. It's purely instrumental, right?
Hmm. Hmm. And so, do you think that moral theories can enter into this kind of causal? Um,
Here's what I think moral theories do. I do think that moral theories provide some clarity, partial rational reconstructions of the kinds of things, the kinds of aspects of relationships that give rise to feelings of obligation. I think that they perform a clarifying function, right? So utilitarianism makes us, really clarifies the way in which our relationship to each other along the lines of being beneficiaries or benefactors or beneficiaries gives rise to all sorts of senses of obligation and duty. I think um, uh, Kant's theory provides us with a lot of sort of clarity as to the way in which certain other relationships that we have to one another give rise to feeling of obligations and duty. So my view is that, but I think that all these moral theories can only do so partially, because I actually think that the relationships that give rise to our feelings of obligation and duty don't fall into a single type or pattern, right? And so, my view of the value of moral theorizing is that it's primarily clarifying in nature. But this won't be surprising to anyone, as my overall view of what the use of philosophy is
that's
that it's
clear from
primarily
Torah.
clarifying in character and critical in character. It's not substantive in the sense that knowledge seeking inquiries generally are.
Right.
Yeah.
So then let's talk for a second right here at the end
Mm-hmm.
about things like effective altruism, which seem so they're extremely theory laden.
Right.
And so let's try
That's,
and get your view on
that's
how
why I
to.
don't think that they're. I don't. That's why I think that they'll never be compelling to more than a very small number of people, because they're only going to be compelling to people who have a very one-dimensional conception of their relationship to others. Right. So, and in my view, a very unnatural one. The fact of the matter is that I stand in way more. This is essentially Ross's criticism of utilitarianism. Ross says utilitarianism is based on the assumption that the only substantial and morally relevant relation that I stand in to other people is that of benefactor to beneficiary or vice versa. And that's just not true. I stand in all sorts of relations to people that give rise to all sorts of duties. And so I think that things like effective altruism and all of these would strike me as very extreme moral stances. And by extreme, I mean extreme in the sense of you must always do this or you must never do that. Or this must always be your overriding consideration, or this must never be an overriding consideration. Always yield recommendations for action that are only going to be compelling to a very small number of people. That's why ethical veganism, if you look at it, it's like a tiny fraction of a percent of the entire population that are vegans. And from what I understand, something like 85% of them ceased being vegans or vegetarians after a relatively short period of time. That is, they don't stick with it. Because I think it's very hard to convince oneself that that very strong kind of Singerites kind of way of thinking about obligation is compelling. And similarly with the, give all your money away to charity, or giving, it is largely Singerites who are doing these sorts of things. And it strikes me it's because they have a very narrow and impoverished conception of the types of relationships that we have to one another, from which our senses of obligation and duty arise. So I do think that in a sense, I do think that a person can be in the grip of a theory, such that the theory then causes them to behave in all sorts of unnatural and perverse ways, right? But notice, it usually doesn't last. That's what the 85% failed vegetarian. That's what the 85% failed vegetarians tells you, right?
For example, certain forms of Christianity and the Mosaic Code and stuff. For example, so I'm thinking about, consider the story of who is it? Was it Jacob and his son, like Isaac? Jacob and Isaac, and Isaac,
Abraham and Isaac.
Was it Abraham and Isaac? And
you're talking about the sacrifice, or God should sacrifice your
sacrifice, kid? The sacrifice. Yeah. Sorry, it's been quite a while since I've been to Sunday school.
Yeah.
So
I've taught Sundays. I've recently taught Sunday school, so I'm a little closer to it. And actually, we did talk about that. So
yeah, we talked about it briefly, but I thought it was worth mentioning here too. So here's a case where in the case of Abraham and Isaac, the overriding moral principle there was follow God's command.
Is it?
Obey God. Okay, let's ask this. That was always what I gleaned from.
Look, I don't want to start us down. I mean, we don't have the time to engage in a lengthy exegesis of the Abraham and Isaac. Let me just say that the Jewish interpretation of this is very different from the Christian one, and it's not at all clear that the Jewish interpretation agrees that God ever even intended Abraham to do any such thing. And so I would almost prefer, if you have a point to make that you're going to use that as an illustration of, I would almost prefer that you use a different example, because I'm not sure we're going to agree on the interpretation of.
Okay, so here's just generally what I was. Let me just tell you what I was trying to illustrate, and I'm pretty sure everyone will be able to think of examples on their own, unless you deny that this is actually a class of that this is a phenomenon that happens. But so the idea is, here's a case where a moral theory is persistent, even though you might think it's kind of perverse. So the perverseness here would be something like an overriding moral principle is doing something for this higher power, even if that includes, obligations not to murder others or whatever. So the idea is, you can imagine that you think that unless you think that all cases in history have not been like this, the idea is there's supposed to be cases in history where people have done some perverse things that they didn't want to, or at least they say that they didn't want to, but because they kind of had an overriding moral obligation to do so, which was to obey kind of divine command or something like that. Now, if you deny that class of case,
how does that require me to accept that what's doing the overriding is the belief in some proposition.
No. I'm not saying a belief. I'm just saying this was just to say that some theory can persist even if it's
But
perverse.
what's the
Which
theory?
was
What's the theory?
the theory is
I ought to do what God says.
yeah, basically.
See, I would say nobody acts on that. People act when they feel duty bound to God.
That's fine. That's fine. But the thing is, you said that the theory describes why we have certain feelings and whatnot, right?
The theory
Um,
describes. The theory describes, at the surface level, the theory describes the general characteristics of rightness and wrongness. That's what a moral theory does. Okay.
yeah.
In doing so, what it's doing is identifying what is the what is the most significant dimension of human relationship, which then gives rise to that feeling of obligation, right? So, for a utilitarian, the surface level account is that the general characteristics of rightness and wrongness have to do with inflicting suffering, okay, pain and pleasure. In saying that, the utilitarian is also saying that the relationship that we have to one another as benefactor to beneficiary is primary. Okay. What I'm saying is that only describes a part of the overall moral picture, because we are not only, in my view, we're not only duty bound to reduce pain and increase pleasure. The sense in which the being in the grip of that theory yields perverse behavior, then, is the sense in which it reflects an incomplete picture of one's obligations and of the underlying relationships that give rise to them, right?
Okay.
So, what I'm not understanding is what is it you're saying is wrong with that? I mean, if you're saying that you think that effective altruists are behaving normally, or that ethical vegans are behaving normally, I would disagree. I would argue that they're behaving perversely, and part of the evidence I bring is that very few people are willing to do it, right? And even the ones that do it don't do it for very long, right? Right? I mean, 85% of vegetarian/vegans cease being a vegetarian/vegans. And that tells me that they're unable to sustain, even though they're in the grip of a theory, they're unable to sustain it. In a sense, nature overrides. Nature ultimately makes that impossible. And this again, I agree with Hume. We're people before we're philosophers. And no philosophical consideration is ever going to override, in the long run, those sorts of considerations. I might be in the grip of a theory that tells me that the external world doesn't exist, but as Hume properly points out, the minute I walk out of my study and out into the world, I'm not going to act like a person who thinks that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not sure what it is you're criticizing. Is it that you're saying no, these people really are behaving? These people aren't behaving in a perverse way, or are you saying something else?
I was saying something much, much more modest.
Okay.
I think that, I wasn't trying to attack almost anything you were saying except for one very, very small point.
Yeah, go
Which
ahead.
is, at one point you said something in particular which caught me, which was perverse theories don't last. And I was just denying that by giving an example of what I thought was a perverse theory which has lasted. That was it.
If I said
take it that
if I said that was a mistake, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is a person's ability to behave perversely because they're in the grip of a theory, that doesn't last. Reality always winds up seeping back in, right? So, the ethical vegan might want to tell himself, okay, well, it's out. Anything where any animal is killed for any reason other than absolute, total, necessary survival is an abomination and should be disallowed. But there's going to come some point at which they're not going to be able to sustain that view, right? Because the view assumes a very narrow conception of obligation that's based on an equally narrow conception of our relationships to others. And similarly with the effective altruist. I just think that there are that the dimensions of our personality and the dimensions of relationship that we have with each other give rise to so many different kinds of duties and obligations that no one theoretical framework can possibly adequately describe them. And so if we ever take on just one of those theories and allow it to, in a sense, be total in our consideration, it's going to cause us to act perversely. Now, I'm not saying that the theory can't be sustained. What I'm saying is the perverse activity can't be sustained. That eventually we're going to wind up acting in ways that go against the theory.
I see. And you're talking in terms of a single individual's lifetime.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. I see where the confusion was arising.
Yeah.
I thought. Yeah. Okay. Great.
I did not mean that the theories don't say, gosh, I mean, utilitarianism is still going.
Right.
I'm saying the capacity of any actual person to do nothing but be a utilitarian their whole life, that is what's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Which is why I generally don't think that these theories are very useful. I think that their usefulness is far outweighed by the perverse uses to which they're put, which is why I generally think a theory like Aristotle, that virtue theories are vastly superior. And I do think that the kind of intuitionism that I'm talking about with respect to obligation and duty, which is still a relatively narrow subject in ethics, is compatible with the kind of Aristotelian virtue theory.
Yeah. So there is just one last thing I'm going to ask you, and then we'll close. And this is actually something I wanted to ask explicitly before. And you might, I think you've alluded to answers to this before, and you might have even explicitly said it, but I missed it. And I think it would be worth. This will probably be a question that's on a lot of the viewers' minds.
Okay.
You've mentioned before that you can be mistaken about which obligation overrides another.
Yes.
And you've even said things like, if someone didn't feel an obligation to help a baby, you'd wonder about their health.
Their mental health.
Their mental health.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's got to be some relationship between making a mistake and you wondering about someone's mental health, in terms of rightness or wrongness to feelings. So, let me try and put frame this question a little bit. So
I don't know that I would want to say that I could give any rigorous account of rightness or wrongness of feeling.
Okay.
I would.
Because I was gonna try and motivate it a little bit. By the way, I was gonna say you might think that you can have right, or you can be right or wrong in a certain sense, in a sense of being. I want to say, and this is going to be slippery talk. I'm going to say it in quotes: justified or unjustified in having a certain feeling. In other domains. So think about, for example, feeling anger. A lot of times we'll be like, he shouldn't have felt anger.
Yeah.
He shouldn't have been angry. Right?
That's really interesting. I'd actually,
and the other thing is there are also objects of feelings which aren't appropriate recipients of certain attitudes. So, for example, if I stub my toe on a rock, I get really pissed off and I'm just like, screw this rock, right? Everyone would be like, dude, an object isn't the appropriate recipient of that reactive attitude. And so you might think similarly, there are some things that aren't appropriate recipients of feelings of obligation or.
Yeah, and I when I talked about being incorrect and I didn't mean anything where I thought I could tell you what right feeling is. And I'm actually very suspicious of that sort of talk. I don't deny that we talk like this all the time. Well, you ought not to have felt that way, or she shouldn't have gotten, she shouldn't have. I actually think that if you try to cash that out, you're going to run out real fast. In other words, I actually don't think that goes very far. I don't think. I think that's a mess. I've actually been thinking about this. I actually have an essay that I've probably started writing 3 or 4 times about the statement, "You ought to feel X." I actually think at a certain level down, it's ill-formed.
Or you shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah. I think it's actually ill-formed, and really what they mean is something else. So let me just say one last thing, though, to clarify, because the way I put it, I could see how it could give rise to this. When I say incorrect, I mean something like the following. I might have decided to meet you for lunch. In other words, I may have, in the context, felt, you know what, an ambulance is probably going to come along and they'll be all right, and he doesn't look that bad, maybe, and so I really feel bad. I've already stood up, Tippens twice. I'm going to go make lunch, go to meet him for lunch, and then later, this may be nagging me. Did I make the right decision? And I may then rethink through the scenario, rethink through the day's events, and I may come to the opposite conclusion. That's the sense in which I meant one can be mistaken.
Mm.
But by the way, that sense of mistakenness is itself fallible,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that there's any,
That's
I don't think
interesting.
a theory is any solution to that. So the fallibility is just something we're going to have to live with.
You know what, I
Um,
actually kind of like that that little account of correctness or incorrectness that you've given, because you haven't. What a lot of times gets philosophers and moral discourse into, or not all philosophers, obviously. By the way, when I say philosophers, just
yeah,
some philosophers into trouble, myself included, before, is when you try to give some rigorous like success conditions
no,
or some rigorous conditions for what it means for
yeah.
something to be
Ethics isn't like that. Look, I mean, look.
correct or incorrect.
If
And you,
ethics was like that, it wouldn't be so hard.
yeah.
I mean, one of the things I like to say to people is like, look, if these moral theories really do what so many people say they're supposed to do, then why are there any moral dilemmas?
Hmm.
Why is making the right decision so damn difficult if there are these nice instructions that come from these beautiful theories that we can show are true or false? Then why are moral conflicts so torturous and difficult? Why are they amongst the most difficult conflicts that we face? That tells me that there aren't any instructions, right? And that we're mistaking what moral theories tell us for kinds of instructions. I say the same thing to religious people. If you really think that the moral instructions and how you're supposed to live are given in the Bible, why do you have any moral dilemmas? Why do you
Hmm.
why isn't your
Dude,
life?
they'd say that's Satan.
Well, if they're Jewish, they're not going to say that because there's no devil in Judaism. There's Satan, but he's just one of God's helpers. Um, uh, but So yeah, I mean, that's all I meant by mistaken. I didn't mean anything more rigorous than that because I don't think anything more rigorous than that can be given.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, obviously, there's a clear account of mistake on the cognitivist or the
Yes,
believist.
but
Or
I
just to be
don't
clear,
I don't
yeah.
believe that they could cash it out.
I just wanted to throw that out
They
there.
can have it,
Try
but I don't
to,
think they can pay for it. And the last thing I'll say, we're exactly at an hour and a half. The last thing I'll say, with respect to the thing about the baby, that's a slightly different case. If I was with some person in this situation, the person exhibited no sense of obligation to save the baby, and then later, in reconsidering the situation, still felt no sense. And in talking to that person, there were no other rival duties. There are no other feelings of obligation that he was obeying and which he felt overrode. Yes, I would think there was something wrong with him because look, at the bottom, I did say to you, there has to, since at the bottom of all moral theorizing and all moral discourse and moral behavior are these feelings of obligation. Feelings are natural occurrences. Now, that doesn't mean they're not socially inflected, but ultimately they arise from us.
Mhm.
And so there is going to be some relationship between our biological natures when combined with their social embeddedness that causes these things to arise. Um, uh, and so, yes, there would be a certain point after which reconsidering and the guy still is reacting the same way. I'd start wondering, are you some sort of sociopath, right? Are you lacking sort of, some equipment that the rest of us have? But again, notice how that would not be a rigorous statement, right? I mean, that would just be a sort of a wondering because I do know that at some level at the bottom there is nature, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And by the way, that's it's actually probably important to note. This actually clarifies the notion of intuition, moral intuition here a little bit more. Sociopaths frequently do things. In fact, they'll do what look like moral things,
right.
right? And in fact, they'll say things such as, X is wrong or X is right. But it turns out that when they say that, what they mean is something very different from us. So we usually express our feelings of obligation or something like that, right? When we'll say something like X is wrong or X is right, but they're just basically stating what is the case relative to some set of rules. So the classic example is with children. If you ask them, hey Timmy, the teacher said you shouldn't chew gum in class. Should you chew gum in class? And he'd be like, no, of course not, right? And obviously this is because he's following some rule that's
Right.
set in the classroom. But then if you ask Timmy, hey, let's say, the teacher's not watching and there's no rule about this. Should you punch Billy? Right? They were like, no, of course not. Right? And here, obviously, they're expressing something different, which is
Right.
not just mere rule following.
Right.
And so, yeah, so the sociopath, obviously he can still behave and he can, have motivation to do things, but he, presumably doesn't get that feeling of obligation, which we typically express when we say, maybe we express when we say things like X is right or X is
Yeah.
wrong.
I think that's the way that they're commonly sort of informally characterized as people that
Yeah.
lack conscience, lack of sense of
Moral obligation.
yeah.
So if it were me having this dialogue with you, man, he'd totally go some kind of cognitivist route.
Right.
Something, yeah. Not saying anything about me.
No, not at all. You're the least sociopathic person. You're a lover, not a fighter.
Oh, thanks. That's exactly what a sociopath would have you think.
Right. So I think that this is
Yeah.
a good place to stop, I think.
This is great.
Well, thank you very much for another very enjoyable conversation.
Dan Kaufman, thank you.
And I look forward to seeing you again in person, maybe over Christmas break. And, of course, over at the Electric Agora.
Always, always. Looking forward to it, Dan.
All right. Take care, my friend.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.